Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Heather Cooke with us. She is the Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization for the Alzheimer Society of British Columbia. She's an adjunct professor at the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia. She also teaches in the Master of Health Leadership and Policy Seniors Care program. She has worked in the field of dementia care in both frontline and research capacity for more than 25 years. She is passionate about improving the lives of individuals living in dementia and their caregivers in diverse care settings. Heather holds a master's degree in gerontology from Simon Fraser University and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Victoria. Welcome, Heather. Thanks for being here, and we're very excited for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Peggy. And just to let folks know that as I'm here today presenting on this work around civility and incivility in long-term care workplaces, that this is work that I have done while I was at UBC and finishing up my postdoc. So I'm not actually wearing my Alzheimer Society hat today. I'm wearing my UBC hat. So, and also as I get started here, I want to just acknowledge the fact that today I'm coming to you from the lands of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples here in Vancouver today. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that you're joining us from near and far as well, and acknowledging the traditional owners of those lands, past and present. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of my colleagues on this project. So the work of Dr. Jennifer Bombush, who is on the UBC School of Nursing, and also my colleague, Rhonda Croft, who is from the BC Nurses Union. And also just to acknowledge the funders of this research and the toolkit about which I'll be talking today. And that's the Alzheimer Society of Canada, WorkSafe BC, Michael Smith Health Research BC, and SafeCare BC. And I just wanted to start with a little bit of background as to how I came to this work. So I was engaged in doing my doctoral work. I have a background in long-term care and was doing an observation. I was doing an ethnography, and I happened to be behind the door witnessing an afternoon care routine. And there were two carries in the room. And all of a sudden, one of the carries started yelling at the resident. It was very clear in that instance that it was an abusive episode, highly unpleasant to witness, highly unpleasant for the resident. And I would have to say one of the most powerful moments of my research career was coming out of that room and having someone with advanced dementia be able to tell me what it felt like in the moment to experience that abuse, to be the recipient of that abuse. And obviously I needed to report that. And so because there was a second carried in the room, I approached her and said, you know, I'm given what just happened, I am obligated to report it. And her comment was, do you have to? And that really wasn't the comment that I was expecting to come out of her mouth. And this was a very competent, kind, genuine, very capable carried. And what she said to me was that the other carried, who was the perpetrator of this verbal abuse, was very powerful. She knew a lot of people, and she was going to make her life hell. And so it started to get me thinking about these workplace relationships. So when it came time to do my postdoctoral research, this is kind of where I landed. And so that's what we're going to walk through and talk about today. So when we think about long-term care, we know that the majority of the hands-on care in long-term care is provided by healthcare aides. That's what we call them here in BC, or PSWs in Ontario. They're primarily women. They're frequently from ethnic minorities, and they have low occupational status. And we know that the current long-term care workplace includes things like excessive workloads, limited resources, and high job demands, all of which are associated with uncivil relationships in other settings. And we certainly know that these issues are becoming more pressing, particularly as we have come through the COVID pandemic. We're really seeing that in ways we haven't seen it before. And it turns out that while workplace incivility and bullying has received lots of attention in acute care settings and done with professional or nursing staff, Almost nothing had been done in long-term care, and certainly nothing had been done in Canada. And so when we're referring to workplace incivility and bullying, I'm really referring to interactions between staff. So not between staff and residents or residents and staff, but simply staff to staff. And we can think of a continuum of behavioral intensity where we've got bullying at one end, incivility in the middle, and civility at the other end. And so when we're thinking about bullying, we're really talking about an escalating hostile relationship in which an employee is frequently and persistently subjected to overtly hostile acts from a coworker or from a supervisor. And in contrast, when we're looking at workplace incivility, we're very much talking about a low intensity deviant act that violates these workplace norms that we have for respectful interactions. And its key characteristic is really this ambiguous intent to harm, which means it's really hard to prove that someone intended to hurt you with the behavior. So it's considered one of the most pervasive forms of antisocial workplace behavior, but its subtlety makes it really difficult to detect. So compared with bullying, uncivil acts are much more likely to be passive, to be indirect, and to be verbal. And so that means they don't necessarily rise to the same level as bullying or harassment like that in our workplace health and safety legislation. So I spent 13 months exploring workplace incivility and bullying in two not-for-profit long-term care homes in British Columbia. And the findings from that research really highlighted how, in contrast to the more egregious or overt acts of bullying, that the care staff primarily encountered peer incivility. So again, the subtle, insidious, passive-aggressive behaviors with this ambiguous intent to harm. And they experienced that in their workplace relationships. And that peer incivility was pervasive. It occurred on an almost daily basis. So I've seen it happen everywhere at any of the homes, noted Olivia, who was an LPN who happened to work at multiple sites. And she says it's almost like it happens so frequently that I kind of just brush it off. But those references to brushing it off, others refer to the importance of letting it slide, really suggests how over time, this ubiquitous nature of incivility becomes this entrenched part of the workplace culture. And so common examples included people gossiping or rumor mongering, forming cliques that included some, but not others, ignoring people, particularly if they were new staff or casuals, at report or shift change, or not responding for requests for help. It could include not saying hello at the start of a shift, or even sabotage. And by that, I mean not passing along the key information that might be needed to complete a certain care task. And then posts on social media. So where that workplace incivility follows us home, it's no longer just constrained to the workplace. And so despite the rarity of exposure to these more overt, direct, egregious acts of bullying, the healthcare aide's frequent exposure to peer incivility had significant impacts in terms of their physical and their mental well-being. So in many ways, their encounters were akin to death by 1,000 cuts. There was no single excessive traumatic event, but just this constant exposure to gossip, to blame, to criticism and exclusion that over time simply wore them down. And as one manager insightfully observed, workplace incivility is the silent killer that operates in the background, effectively sabotaging relationships, teamwork, and well-being. Now, the gendered nature of long-term care contextualizes a lot of the references that were made by research participants as to how their workplace relationships made them feel like they were still in high school. So the gossiping, the rumor mongering, the cliques, social exclusion, the tit for tat behavior, or when someone did something that simply pissed them off. And so many of these behaviors were seen by participants as inherently feminine traits. that were just part and parcel of working in a workplace that was dominated by women. But this suggests that such behavior may also be a reaction to the setting in which women find themselves. So, in a workplace where formal status, power, and recognition are difficult to achieve, women compete for power and status in other ways through that use of those squabbles, the petty squabbles, the blame, the criticism. But the challenge with this discourse and attributing traits to simply being women is that it sanctions this incivility and simply allows bad behavior to continue unabated. And so the healthcare aides experiences appear illustrative of relational aggression, which is a concept that's been used extensively in research examining bullying amongst teenage girls, but one that's rarely been used in workplaces. And it refers to this non-physical, manipulative, exclusionary form of social aggression that threatened relationships and that encapsulated their behaviors. So it's a little surprise that the healthcare aides actually referred to their workplaces as just like high school, a setting in which many of these behaviors predominate. And so research also suggests that women are socialized to express frustration and emotion in non-threatening ways. So they would tend to resort to the more manipulative means of resolving conflict and establishing dominance. And so women are far more likely to use relational aggression as their weapon of choice. So in terms of the exposure to peer incivility and bullying, there was, whoops, skipping ahead. There we go. Skipping this exposure created this real reluctance to seek assistance from coworkers with whom they had had a previous altercation, for example, or who had made it obvious that they didn't want to assist the healthcare aide, or implied that the healthcare aide was incompetent because of their need for assistance. And so the nonverbal cues that were displayed following requests for help, such as puffing or eye rolling, really conveyed this sense of being inconvenienced. So that relatively early on in their positions, staff would stop asking certain coworkers for assistance or for help. And the reluctance to request help also stemmed from not wanting to be viewed as incompetent, because incompetence, whether it was real or fabricated by unhelpful coworkers, was equated with powerlessness. And this is a potent motivator amongst the healthcare aides. And the healthcare aides were also cognizant of the behaviors that were valued by and would ensure help from coworkers. And so these notions of worthiness and reciprocity really featured very prominently as they talked about their experiences. So to be considered worthy of receiving help, a healthcare aide had to work independently and efficiently. And then exposed to these structural factors that really commonly contribute to our increased workloads. So things like the health human resource crisis, the staffing shortages, the under-resourcing, the increased resident complexity that we see in long-term care these days. Healthcare aides were really sensitized to the potential sources of power inequities and that need to maintain balance. So one of the care aides, one of the participants shared, you've got to play the game. You've got to make sure if you do something nice for somebody, that they're always going to do something back to you nice. And so the power relations that underpinned the healthcare aides workplace relationships led some staff to resist help and other longer tenured care aides to resist helping the newer healthcare aides. And so during repeated participant observations on a wing where many residents were designated as two-person transfers or two-person lists, it was really interesting to see the healthcare aides' different patterns of helping behavior. So, for example, Leah, who was one of the youngest and newest healthcare aides on that particular wing, she tended to resist help, insisting that she could complete the care for all these 10 residents by herself, no assistance required. Catherine, who was slightly older, a little more experienced, sought help with lifts and transfers for 2 of the 10 residents. While Emily, who was much more experienced, a much older care aide, expected help with at least 4 of the 10 residents. And important to keep in mind here that all of those 10 residents had been earmarked as requiring a 2-person assist or a 2-person transfer. And so assistance was rarely offered to Emily, who was the one that would seek help with, around 2 of the residents, or to Catherine, who would seek assistance with 4 or more residents. And when they did request it, it was common that they had to wait. That really was illustrative of their place within that informal power hierarchy. And then Leah's reluctance to accept help, who was, very adamant that she could handle the residents, she could do this by herself, suggests that she was aware of those power relations that were ongoing. And, her way to seek acceptance and power was about demonstrating that self-sufficiency and that independence by doing the care solely by herself. So it was apparent once we finished the research that there was this desperate need for some specific sector-specific, I should say, resource to address workplace incivility in long-term care, or to support long-term care organizations to recreate these civil workplaces. And so we partnered with SafeCare BC, which is an industry-funded, not-for-profit association here in British Columbia, whose mission it is to ensure injury-free, safe working conditions for continuing care workers. And membership in SafeCare BC is automatic for all care providers in BC, with the exception of the Health Authority owned and operated sites, which is only about 1/3 of our long-term care homes here in BC. So we brought together representatives from 3 primary healthcare unions representing care staff, so the BC Nurses Union, the BC General Employees Union, and the Hospital Employees Union, along with industry partners, to create Civility Matters. So this is an online toolkit to support staff to address workplace incivility and long-term care, and to promote supportive and collaborative workplace relationships. And you can see the address here just on the bottom of the screen. And so really our goal with the toolkit was twofold. We wanted to raise awareness about the nature and the impact of workplace incivility on staff well-being and care delivery. And then we also wanted to provide practice-based scenarios, strategies, and resources for addressing workplace incivility. And there's 2 ways to enter the toolkit. You can either enter as a frontline staff, or you can enter as a leadership staff member. So there's lots of overlap in the site between the resources and the various pieces that comprise the toolkit. And it's not that you have to prove you're one staff member, one staff type or another to enter the site. So you can certainly go back and forth and see, have a look at what the other group of folks are seeing. So when you first land into the toolkit, one of the first pages that you'll land on is some definitions of incivility and bullying. So really exploring what is the nature of incivility and what is the impact. And so this section really highlights the consequences of workplace incivility and bullying. So pieces that's pulled from other research in this area. So we know that it's associated with decreased job satisfaction, decreased engagement, increased sickness, and increased burnout. And so there's an overview of the research we conducted and a downloadable infographic, which highlights the key findings. And then there's how civil is your workplace. And so this really encourages toolkit users to reflect whether they've been the recipient or the witness of workplace incivility or bullying, or if they've ever been uncivil. And one of the sayings we have is, if you look around your workplace and you can't see the workplace bully, perhaps it's time to look into the mirror, because it might actually be you. And so we've conducted a series of webinars over the last 5 years related to this topic, and those can also be accessed on the website. And then the other key part of the website are these practice-based scenarios. So there's an initial, I think there's 11 that are in there, that were drawn from the behaviors we observed or heard about during our original research. And so we present a scenario and then we ask the toolkit user to choose a response. So an example might be whenever Stephen calls Laura to assist him with a transfer, she never answers her phone. This has become a pattern, and many other staff on the floor are becoming frustrated with Laura and how she doesn't help her partner with transfers. What should Stephen do? Another example is there's a tendency for weekend staff to call in sick. It's not always a specific person, but it impacts everyone's workload. It's a Sunday morning, and Dallas has just called in sick. The nurse in charge, Lindsay, overhears staff gossiping about her frequent fake sick calls. How should Lindsay address this? So again, work through those scenarios and think about, reflect on, what are some of the options for responding in that situation. And there's another 5 scenarios that we've developed that will be uploaded, I believe, this month. And then another 5 or 6 that will be coming in late spring, early summer. So there's also a resources page. This is really where we've tried to collate information around civility, courageous conversations, how to sort of address and deal with workplace incivility, or how to promote civility within a workplace. And so there's books, videos, TED Talks. And what we've tried to do is sort of annotate the length of time it'll take to get through a particular section. So if someone jumps into the website and they've got 10 minutes, they can kind of figure out what they can look at or read within that 10-minute period. And then we had a very talented research assistant who pulled together these kindness cards. And so there's downloadable templates on the toolkit. And so one of them says, the front of it says, "You're awesome." And then you flip it over on the back and it says, "Have a wonderful day, as wonderful as you are." Another one says, "I couldn't help but notice all of the positive things that you bring to the team. Thank you for being you." And a third one, "Kindness is contagious," and it's tag, "You're it, pass it on." So this idea that you can print those off, staff can have them, and just kind of, leave them around the workplace, just to kind of promote this sense of positivity and civility within the workplace. So just to wrap up, and kind of some of the key takeaways from today's session and from this work, is really there's evidence that left unaddressed, incivility and bullying really become this accepted part of workplace culture. And the gendered nature of incivility and the ways in which power is experienced and channeled really highlights the importance of developing these gender-informed workplace policies and procedures. And our findings really highlight the problematic, subtle, and insidious workplace interactions that don't rise to that level of overt, explicit bullying that is commonly prohibited in workplace law or organizational policy. So our current policies and procedures quite often focus on these egregious behaviors. So more on that bullying and harassment end of things, as opposed to the incivility, what we might term bad behavior or toxicity in the workplace. And so again, thinking about the verbal abuse, the threats, the taunting that's related to prohibited grounds in the Human Rights Code, derogatory name calling, and unnecessary physical contact are all very masculine notions of bullying and harassment. And they're not so much the feminine interactions, and thinking back to that slide on relational aggression that we saw in this research. So I think there's a real role for occupational health and safety committees when we think about long-term care homes within this work, and thinking about, we spend a lot of time talking about slip and trip hazards within a care home environment, but we spend a lot less time talking about toxicity or incivility in the workplace. And yet when someone resists help or ignores a colleague's request for help, and they go ahead with that transfer of the resident by themselves, they're putting themselves and the resident at risk of injury. So with the creation of the toolkit, staff really do now have a way of shifting the conversation towards civility, to assisting with respectful communication and conflict resolution within our long-term care workplaces. So again, just a thank you to all of the folks who worked on this project. If you are interested in learning more, we have 2 open access publications right here, one in Work, Employment and Society, and the other one in the Gerontologist, and we can always see that those links are sent out after the fact. And a big thank you to Caitlin Bauman, who did all of the fantastic artwork that we saw today. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Peggy.
Thank you, Heather, for sharing your research and also sharing the toolkit. This is the next part of the seminar. We will start with a panel discussion. So we will get to explore this topic a bit more deeper by inviting our multidisciplinary experts to our panel discussion. We have Dr. Jennifer Bombish, who is an expert in gerontological nursing, a professor, and a CIHR chair in sex and gender science relating to the dynamics of caregiving in an aging society at the University of British Columbia's School of Nursing. We have Dr. Amanda Grenier, who's a social gerontologist. She's a professor at the Factor in Wattash, Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto, the Norman and Honey Chipper Chair in the Gerontological Social Work, and a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. We also have Dr. Habib Chaudhary, who's an environmental gerontologist, a professor and chair at the Department of Gerontology, and an associate director in the Gerontological Research Center at the Simon Fraser University. He's also affiliated with the Center for Research on Personhood and Dementia and the Center for Advancing Health Outcomes at the University of British Columbia. And we have Dr. Winnie Burda. She's an expert in health services organization and management science. And as you may recall, she's also the co-coordinator of the seminar series based at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to first start with some reflections that we have on Heather's seminar. We will first go around our virtual table and ask our esteemed panel to first share their thoughts about Heather's seminar and then ask questions that they might have of Heather. And after the panel has shared their thoughts and asked their questions, I will then call upon each of the panel members to ask more specific questions pertaining to their area of expertise. So let's get started and start with Jennifer. Jennifer, you're the co-author to Heather's article on incivility in long-term care. Would you like to share some of your thoughts on the presentation and ask Heather a question?
Absolutely. I think, I have been a nurse now for almost 30 years, and I started my career working in long-term care, and that's really as a nurse where I feel at home and where I prefer to work. And so when Heather started doing this research, well into my career, all of it resonated so much and just gave me flashbacks to those night shifts and evening shifts and that huge anxiety as a new grad working in a long-term care home where I was often the team leader of people, care aides who had way more experience than I had, working with nurses who had particular ideas about a BSN prepared nurse, because that was just at a period of time when we had more nurses graduating with their bachelor's degree than were diploma prepared. And so it brought a lot back. And it was sad for me that things really haven't changed. And I think that part of this is also around the context of work, the staffing levels, the under-resourcing in this sector. One of the things that I absolutely love about this project, and that we rarely see in research anywhere, is this incredible research industry partnership that unfolded over the course. And to see the toolkit that Heather has created, and I don't think it comes across when she shares it how complex that was, because it involved working with multiple unions who are involved in BC's long-term care sector. They all sat at the table together, bringing together SafeCare BC, other employer types of organizations to come together and agree on the content that would be going into this toolkit that's now available online. And so sometimes we hear it takes, 17 years or 20 years from research to go from sort of doing the research to getting into practice. And here we see very much a project that very quickly transferred from doing the research to having tangible tools online that people can use. I know Heather has done so many workshops around British Columbia with Rhonda, who I think needs to be acknowledged as well. So I guess my question for Heather is just, how did you organize? What is that saying about, organizing cats in business, or like trying to get everybody together on the same page, working together cohesively towards the shared goal, really around improving workplace civility at the actual point of care. And Heather, maybe you could comment a bit. Oh, herding cats. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I learned that a long time ago from Heather Lastinger at Western University. Like how, what were some of the key things that kept that group coming together, built their commitment to the project? And what work did you need to do as the project lead to really make that bridge from research to practice happen in such a really relatively efficient and quick way?
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. And I think, can everyone hear me okay? I know there were maybe some issues before. Yeah, okay. I think it really speaks to the importance of having those partners on board from the get-go. So we really made this concerted effort, and Jennifer and I sort of sat down and thought about, like, who do we need to have at the table, and extending out to those organizations, inviting folks to that initial meeting, and to really have it be a bit of a exploration and discovery meeting, and just, hey, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're hearing. And I think because it's an issue that really unites a lot of folks in the sector, because as you say, Jennifer, you think back over your 30 years, and I can think when I was on the front lines as well at the start of my career, and experiencing similar things. So I think it really speaks to that, and bringing people on right at the start, and then really engaging them in the entire process. So it wasn't that we just brought the folks on to do the toolkit. We had engaged with them, and we had this advisory committee over the course of the research. And so being able to say, here's the findings, what are some ways that we might present this? And it was really kind of that brainstorming where folks are like, you know what, it would be really great if there was something online. Is there, how do we collate all these resources? How do we put all of this in one spot? So really, kudos to them. It was very much that team approach. So starting early and really keeping those partners engaged and close at hand.
Great, thank you for your response, Heather. And I think this, with Heather's response, it closely relates to Whitney's work. So I was wondering if Whitney, you would like to go next with your thoughts and questions?
Oh, sure. And in fact, I think one of my comments has a fair bit to do with kind of the toolkit and the context in which it was developed in the broader context. I mean, thank you so much, Heather. This is amazing, amazing work. It really resonates with me. I kept thinking about this overarching theme that seemed to emerge as you were speaking around power, right? And power differentials. And these systemic structural factors that, are pervasive, particularly in this sector of healthcare. I mean, the healthcare system, at least in Canada and many Western countries, has historically privileged other sectors, right? Particularly favoring acute care and so on. And so we have this issue around long-term care as a sector. We have the population of older people who, dare I say, are perhaps undervalued in some societies, and Western societies in particular. There's a workforce that cares for this population, who are also undervalued. And in addition, as you mentioned, they derive from, racialized groups, predominantly women. So I really love the toolkit, and I appreciated what its function and promise is. And I wondered also if we can address, can you develop a toolkit that addresses societal incivility? I mean, frankly, in part, that's what we're talking about. And I'm not to be frivolous. I mean, this is, you're talking about the context of organizations, facilities. They're situated in these broader contexts that continue to persistently, right, reinforce this this pervasive undervaluing, disproportionate power, right, allocation, and so on. Not a problem we can solve today, but certainly something that your work is beginning to address, which is marvelous. And then I really would like to talk as part of the panel, I think more broadly, about, and hear from you in particular, about how you see, this is one of the first sessions that has focused on things psychosocial, kind of facets of the work environment that's psychosocial. Other prior sessions have focused on the influence of the kind of physical, tangible features of work environments. I wonder how you see these interrelating. For example, are there physical features of nursing home environments that might reinforce or be particularly tolerant of uncivil behavior amongst staff and residents and residents and residents? That's it. Thank you.
Heather, would you like to answer that question?
Well, you know what? I was thinking that that commentary, Whitney, really ties in nicely. I've just got to find him on my screen with Habib's work around the physical environment. And so I actually might toss this one over to Habib to sort of gather his thoughts or garner his thoughts around the role of the physical environment. I certainly have some thoughts, but I'm going to defer to Habib and invite him maybe to share some first.
Okay. Thank you, Heather, for the wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. And I think before I respond to the question, I think that's what I was planning to do that anyway, to address the environmental context and how that is relevant. I do want to acknowledge the importance of what you presented, Heather. I think we talk about, if you look at the literature in long-term care, there's a great deal of emphasis on the quality of life of the residents. And I wonder whether anybody has comparatively analyzed the amount of work focusing on residents versus staff. And we know that staff, if you want to have good quality of life for residents, you have to have good quality of life for the staff, which means a lot, and which we know because of the pandemic in particular about being understaffed, overworked, underpaid, and all that. So it's a really important topic that we're addressing here about staff work environment. So having said that, I think we need to acknowledge that, and you mentioned that, Heather, that incivility, workplace incivility among staff could be associated with the stress level and their quality of interaction with residents, and also residents' own anxiety and agitation and responsive behavior that would impact staff stress level. So there's some interesting connections potentially to be made, some direct between the quality of the physical environment and staff experience, and some more mediating associations, relationships through the residents' experience. So I will just share a few thoughts here. One is, and some of this is coming from some anecdotal experience, some of it is some of the studies we have done comparing a more traditional long-term care settings, so 50 plus units, resident unit, versus a small household. That's what we call small houses or household, which are 10 to 12, 14 residents units. So, and there are quite a few studies done in the US in the Greenhouse Project, looking at the small household model's impact on not only residents' quality of life, but staff quality of care practices and so on. So one is again, the household size is critically important about, in terms of providing support for the residents, but also for the staff. And I'll just throw out a few things that are potentially relevant here. One is the quality of stimulation. We talk about environmental stimulation, which comes from high noise level, high lighting, institutional lighting, furnishing everything. These impact, we know these do impact residents' anxiety, but these could also impact staff as well in terms of the quantity and quality of stimulation they're taking in and day out. So imagine working in a very traditional long-term care setting as a staff versus working in a very small scale household. The stimulation level is quite different, and this is an accumulative effect over time. The second thing is what we call about the behavior setting idea, that we get our cues of what we want to do in terms of behavior through the setting. So we talk about in the context of people with dementia that they are very sensitive to environmental cues. And I think one could argue the same thing would apply to staff, meaning that am I working in your home, or this is my workplace and I'm caring for you, right? So that kind of a psychosocial attitude and perception could be different when you talk about staff working in traditional long-term care units versus a more small scale household units. Another thing that is about staff break rooms, or what we call about where they can take a break, and that's an interesting area, which is from architectural standpoint, it's neglected. We just have a basement where people can go and spend some time during their breaks. So it's not a purposeful, it's not high demand. It doesn't get much attention from design perspective until recently. So that's something we would argue that there's a possible connection between different kinds of staff break spaces and that impacting staff interaction or not. Another thing is about coming back to household is that the group size for staff. So if we think about like how many care aides are interacting with each other, and I have a question about that, Heather. So does that make a difference? So if I'm a care aide working with 10 to 12 other care aides and nursing staff in a large care home versus in a small household, I'm interacting with a fewer number, 4 to 5. Does that make a difference that I'm less likely to be incivil? And the last point I would say is about the issue of speaking of design is a shared room versus single rooms. So we know that shared rooms have impact on many levels in terms of impacting residents' sleep quality, visitation by family, as well as incivility and aggression within residents. So on the other hand, we know that there's evidence about how staff have better quality of interaction with residents in single rooms versus double rooms. So I wonder about that, and that's about, one could connect that might be a mediating factor about contributing less or more to staff's anxiety level. So these are a few thoughts that I have about some possible direct impact on staff stress and interaction with each other, and some are more mediated through residents' anxiety and functioning challenges. So I do have a question for Heather, if I may ask.
Mm-hmm.
My question for Heather is about the issue of staff. You talked about the demand for work. It's a very high demand work, and they're stressed and so on because of that. And what are your thoughts, or did you see any relationship with a comparative perspective on an environment A, which has less stress? So speaking of stress, if you look at in a quantitative perspective, stress as a concept, high stress versus low stress environment impacting civility.
Yeah, really like that question, Habib, and it's a thought-provoking one. And I think, you know, the sites at which we conducted the research were similar. But I think to answer that question, I would probably reflect on my time working on the front lines. So when I was working on the front lines 25 years ago, and we look at if someone called in sick, we rarely worked short. Like I don't actually remember. Like it would be a really rare occurrence where we would be working short on the shift, and everyone was collegial and keen to come to work. And we never thought we were working in the golden era. You know, Jennifer, you know, when you think back to that time, that was a time when staff were well paid. There was time for education, and you were replaced if you were away. And, you know, fast forward to when I was doing this research, and there were times when I would walk into the second home in which we were doing the research, and on the board that would list kind of who was on that afternoon, there'd be one name. And that was it out of, you know, a unit that had sort of 25 residents. And so there were 2 spots that they needed to fill. And then that meant that someone stayed late. And so those demands that were placed upon the staff, right? So, and then if you know, staff felt that a staff member was taking too much time off, or happened to take a day off and then posted a picture of themselves on Facebook at a Canada Day parade, as opposed to, you know, lying on the couch, then staff are that much more sort of resentful, I think, when that staff member comes back, because they're not replaced. So that staff member who takes that day off is then punished because we just don't have those health human resources that we had previously. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, but I think those demands, a lot of it comes from, you know, who we have, are we able to fill shifts, and we just don't have the bodies. It'll be interesting to hear. I know, you know, there's probably a number of folks on the call who could probably, you know, speak more to that. So.
Thanks, Heather, for your thought on Habib's question. Amanda, would you like to share your thoughts on your question?
Sure. Yeah, so thank you, Heather, for your presentation and for drawing attention to this work. I'm going last, so a number of the points that I want to bring up have been raised, but I think in a slightly different way. So one of the, what I really appreciate about this work is drawing attention to how power relations are operating in practice in a really complex setting that, as Habib mentioned as well, is a workplace, and it's also a home. And I think that's a piece to really be the tension to be holding on to. It's both and, right? It's not either or. It's not just a workplace and it's not just a home. And so that, to me, is this important piece for trying to figure out what to do about it. And that's where the question is that I want to go towards. I have a couple of other pieces to bring up. So I really appreciate the toolkit as well as an instrument of change, right? So it starts if, you know, on some level, the research is really just starting this conversation, and then the toolkit kind of keeps that conversation going in a different way. And the piece I'd like to raise in this is that it links with the societal questions that maybe we should be having that are really about, like, what does it mean to care for each other as a society, for, you know, to give and to receive care. So we often talk about good care, you know, what is good care? And that might be a principle, but what also is what are the kind of human aspects of care when we're met with vulnerabilities? And so, you know, I'm often looking at the side of older people and the way that people get excluded within systems or by systems, powerful practices. And so this is another example of how both the workplace staff are being excluded from each other, you know, and I would imagine that also the residents are being excluded because you don't also want to be engaging in conflict. You know that there's a conflictual staff relation happening. And so how is that maybe furthering your exclusion? So the piece I would like to think about is about care, vulnerability, and power. And I guess it extends beyond your research. So you may not really have the evidence to answer it, but it's really like, how did what you saw, how did you kind of imagine that affecting older people's lives and vice versa, right? And how maybe does the exclusion of older people in neglected spaces like long-term care also further the power dynamics of who gets recognized, you know, whose lives are valued and who should be kind of respected. And so you see all of these dynamics. But what did you see? How can you imagine what you were seeing was affecting older people? And in some way you started there when you said, the person came to me and said it was like this. But that's the question I have for you. Yeah.
And it's such an interesting question. I think you really nail it, Amanda, when you said how complex the situation is. There's a lot of pieces at play, and we didn't directly measure the impact on the residents, but you could sense that in those observational occurrences, right? So as you're witnessing care and you're witnessing how in a time where staff are working together, where there's that good working relationship, that collaboration, and how the resident sort of is more relaxed in that situation. And I can think of an observation where a resident was having their incontinent product changed, and the staff were bickering back and forth around how it should be positioned, and what it must feel like to be caught in that back and forth. And at that point, the resident was in their wheelchair. But if you think about how we care for residents, and we often we use mechanical lifts, and so then if you're starting, staff are getting into it, and someone's in this real position of vulnerability, you're partially clothed, you're suspended from the ceiling, and that tension that you might feel. So not something that we necessarily explored, but I think would be a real avenue for future, because I think that's part of it. As Habib said, we know that the best line to having contented residents and good quality of life for residents is ensuring we have good quality of work life for the staff. And so you would intuit that there is this relationship there, and how do we protect that vulnerability of residents. And I think about your comment about whose lives are valued, and that caring work that's done, and the work that folks on the front lines in our long-term care homes do is incredibly hard to begin with, and then to have to layer this on top of it makes it even more challenging. How do we make it so that we extend that same compassion that we extend to the residents to each other, and create those supportive workplaces? Yeah.
Well said, Heather, and thanks for that question, Amanda. Now we'll get into the next part of the panel discussion, where we ask a bit more specific questions to each of the members. Heather's answer to Amanda's question is a good segue to coming back to you, Jennifer. So they talked about highlighting these profound impacts of caregiving dynamics on the well-being of staff and the residents. So giving your experience in caregiving dynamics, I just want to know what your thoughts are like. Do you think it's likely that this workplace incivility effects extend to residents' well-being and quality of life and care directly and indirectly?
Oh, absolutely. So I think, we always think of, and Habib has mentioned this and others, Pat Armstrong's words, the conditions of work are the conditions of care. And of course, it's impacting resident care. It's impacting residents when people are bickering over the top of their head because, you do this, you do that. And I know there was other examples from Heather's work, and that goes back to the built environment where we now have environments where we don't have call bells. So everybody's holding a phone. So there are staff that just turn off their phone and just don't respond. And then you really are working alone on your shift, right? So some of the things that we've done that we think are wonderful and are going to create certain outcomes are having other balancing types of outcomes that are quite negative. So I absolutely think that this is an issue. And I think as researchers who are doing workplace research, a lot of focus has been on staff burnout, staff empowerment, and maybe it's time to start asking staff about the context of bullying and incivility in their work and being able, certainly with some of our big data systems, to be able to start doing some analysis looking at what is the direct or indirect impacts of levels of incivility in your workplace on resident outcomes. Because I think that we're there from a research point of view, but it's really thinking about collecting that kind of data that would be allowing us to look at those outcomes more clearly.
Great, thank you for that answer, Jennifer. And I would like to, perhaps ask Habib the next question. So you've listed out some of the factors in the physical environment that may influence or impact the outcomes in work and living environments. I was just wondering, what do you think future research programs could look like? Kind of picking upon what Jennifer had said at the end there, with future research possibilities. She touched on upon noise, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many areas of research that we can talk about. Maybe we'll touch on a few. One is, well, some of the things I mentioned earlier, would each of them be a research direction or research focus, but a few things that I will point out. One thing I have not mentioned in specific terms is the, again, talking about innovation in long-term care, especially in the environmental context, we talk about the value, and we have quite a substantial body of literature on which documents, which is evidence on the impact of positive impact of small households, which by small, I'm talking about 12 to 14. We talk about 12 being a limit at this point. There's a good optimal size on the quality of the residents, but we don't have much on quality of care and staff quality of life. But the other thing is a broader context about staffing models. So what I'm referring is that how many, when we talk about, when we deal with or interact with organizations who are thinking about building a new care home, and we say, okay, these are the evidence about, that small care homes can help residents' quality of life, and they would say, okay, this sounds good, but operationally it's complicated. We may not be able to move this forward in terms of operational, in terms of how the staffing model works. So we really need to have some research looking at this disconnect, this gap between small household and appropriate staffing models. So, by staffing model, the staff resident ratio, and then whether there's universal worker model, whatever the model might be, with the household model that could work. And I would extend that to our topic today is, do these innovative staffing models, and in conjunction with a small household setting, could potentially affect incivility and more better teamwork or so and so on. So that's one area. Another area is the more specific term is about staff workspaces, and we kind of touched on that. So staff workspaces traditionally included like a big nurses station. So that is kind of a legacy from the acute care model. But again, if you look at the innovative newer models, we talk about moving away from those architecturally prominent nursing stations to a more workspaces that are embedded in the social heart, social spaces, part of a living area, part of a kitchen, and so on. So the question becomes, is this this approach does create a more home-like setting, but how does it affect staff communication, interaction with each other and their work quality of work, the charting and whatnot? So I think I would like to, I think that would be an interesting area to look at. And finally, what we talked about earlier is about the residents' quality of life, functioning, responsive behaviors, and so on, impacting staff stress and potentially impacting incivility, that those connections could be carefully looked at. So, and I think the issue of stress or workload from, or maybe we'll put it this, the quality of care given by staff to residents, to what extent that is impacting incivility and vice versa, to what extent incivil behavior is contributing to stress and contributing to quality of care. So, but that's not an environmental question per se, but I think that's a research question that we could also pose. But I think I mentioned a few other environmental issues, and also wayfinding is an issue as well. We know spatial navigation is a problem in many care homes where staff need to help residents mobility in the morning from their home, from their rooms to the social spaces, and then also in the afternoon sometimes, and how these impact staff workload and so on. So I think there's some interesting areas to look at more directly on environment's impact on staff interaction with each other and potentially incivility, as well as through the mediating factor of residents' quality of life.
Great, thanks, Habib. So my next question will be to Amanda. We're struck by Heather and her colleagues' observations around gendered work environments that's long-term care, and the fact that direct care is offered predominantly to frail older female residents by women belonging to historically marginalized population in an ageist society that generally also undervalues older adults. So given your perspective as a social gerontologist, how do you understand Heather's presentation and research in light of your own expertise and in research across care settings, and in particular in the marginalized groups?
And that's 2 minutes of a response. Actually, when someone had actually just put this in the chat as well, I can't quite see the whole thing. Christine had just mentioned. So, to quickly come back. So my research started on frailty, and it was always about how older women, it was social constructs of frailty. So how women were labeled as frail and didn't necessarily understand themselves as frail. And frailty ended up being a lot more about both structural relations, like the power, kind of the gendered dynamics, immigration, migration issues, and the interpersonal piece of how they felt when someone stigmatized or excluded them for being frail. And so, Heather's presentation has drawn attention to the extent to which these structural macro issues are playing out of discrimination and often migrant status, are playing out in this micro kind of setting or case of institutional or long-term care. So I think the piece to keep coming back to is not to lose sight of the larger structural, societal, and global. We haven't even mentioned the global pieces about global migrant care chains, et cetera, that people are often kind of coming here and then caring transnationally. So not to lose sight of that, but then to also think about that interpersonal bit about emotions. And so thinking about trauma, so that, workers are bringing trauma, residents are bringing trauma, and those are related to the systemic injustices. So looking at the emotion, that's why I thought the card piece, the cards that you had at the end were one really interesting example. If we think about the question of knowing that we have these systemic issues, how do we foster good civil human relationships between workers, staff, clients, everyone, right? The older people themselves. And that was a really good example. It's one example, and there might be others. And so we need to start asking people, what would feel better? You know, what would make your work or your day feel better? And people know that, and they're really often small things. And this is maybe where there are links with some of what Habib was talking about the physical environments. Maybe it's music, maybe it's, I just want someone to say hi to me, or I want them to know where I came from, or I want them to know what my, you know, what my daily life looks like. You know, I'm a worker and a person, right? A human. So that's what I would kind of wrap up quickly in this, and is continuing the conversations. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And now over to you, Whitney. The work that Heather and her colleagues highlights the micro and meso level interactions within organization. Given your expertise in organizational behavior, how do the observations made by Heather and her colleagues sit with respects to this broader macro level of health, human resources issues that we have in the long-term care sector?
Yeah, so I'll put on my org behavior or work psychology hat for a moment. I mean, we've all talked about, and Heather began with talking about the long-term care sector and the shortages and the turnover and difficulties in recruitment and the burnout that is now so evident. And you know, others have highlighted long-term care as kind of the sector of last resort, right, for some workers. Unfortunate, but I think true. What might be done? I mean, people, to Amanda's very good point, I mean, people are people. You know, long-term care workers, I think, are motivated or demotivated, just as any other workers are in their workplace, right? They're human. They have needs of their work environments, not just financial security, but they have needs for self-actualization. They have needs for safety and a sense of support on the part of their workplace. They have needs for knowledge and for personal growth. So I think we need to acknowledge that. I think that's a huge step. It sounds odd, but I somehow, for some reason, I simply don't see that kind of conversation really in this sector in particular. I think we need to recognize the linkages between workers' attitudes, how they feel about their work, how they feel about themselves and their performance, and worker outcomes and outcomes in this instance, in this particular context, as it relates to the people for whom they care. And think about incivility and psychosocial and environmental impacts on things like work motivation, work attitudes, work performance, worker mental health and well-being. Bring all that together. You know, as has been done in many other industries, there's an abundance of research that's situated in organizational behavior broadly, but it's, you know, it engages organizations in multitude of industries. And why couldn't this work be applied to thinking about, you know, the concerns and issues and challenges of these workers in particular? Job mobility. Think about job mobility in the long-term care sector. No one gives a thought to that. No one thinks about progression, right? Progressing in one's career, whether you begin as a healthcare aide or a nurse, you know, in a long-term care facility. It's so very interesting that this has been completely overlooked. And then I think you were going to ask me about innovation, shall I? Right? And how, just not that we choreographed this at all, but we did talk about some of the topics that we might cover. So, you know, and I think about, you know, what Heather was saying in her presentation. I couldn't help but think, oh my gosh, think about how profoundly this kind of work environment must be influencing not only individuals and how they feel, how they behave, the kinds of behaviors that they decide to exhibit or not, pro-social behaviors, extra role behaviors, you know, the kinds of things that are outside of one's role, but, you know, going that extra mile for their residents, you know, those kinds of behaviors and lead to innovation. And in these kinds of environments, which are not environments that one would describe as, you know, environments of positive affect, that's the term that folks in the OB world use, as you know. They're not happy work environments. In these kinds of environments, there is very little demonstration of those kinds of behaviors that are extra role that lead to innovation. So think about that. That's a profound, potentially profound finding, that in fact, this is a suppressive environment in which innovation is not occurring, or it's just occurring in spite of all these suppressors. And in fact, it's these kinds of negative work environments also lead, the literature says, to withdrawal of behaviors, right? Not only withdrawal of extra role behaviors, but withdrawal of in-role behaviors, absences, things like this. And, it's an understandable human, workers are workers, people are people, human response to negative environments.
Great, thank you, Whitney. And thank you, panel, for your discussion on this topic. It really highlights that interconnectedness between the physical and psychosocial environments and, the work and living environments that is long-term care. So we'll move on to our next section, this next portion of the seminar, which is the Q&A. We get to open this Q&A session up to our audience, and Sarah has been reading your questions and comments, and she will be facilitating the Q&A. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much. So if anyone is interested in posing a question, please feel free to raise your hand or type your question in the chat. Also, you're very welcome to hop off of mute. I haven't seen very many questions in the chat so far, but we did have some comments from Christine. And so Christine's comments were touched upon by Amanda, but also alluded to, these legal and regulatory frameworks, while possibly well-intentioned, to promote the health of residents. At the same time, they can also limit the power of care staff. In Christine's example, I believe she mentioned Ontario long-term care laws prohibit abuse against residents, but if you're a staff experiencing abuse, you are more or less on your own in that you have to pursue a civil suit, something that can be very difficult to do. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
Oh, absolutely. That so much of what we saw, and I think kind of alluded to this in the presentation, is that this is this relational aggression, which is horribly hard to prove. And so trying to make that case, even if you take it forward, if you're fortunate enough to work in a unionized environment, and you can take that forwards with a union rep, still trying to prove that. And that's those very egregious behaviors, it's very hard to get any kind of traction on. And then you think about, as Amanda and Whitney both talked about, and Christina talked about here about, marginalized workers, and thinking about who are our frontline workers these days, and, coming from abroad and not wanting to make waves, and, wanting to be accepted and fit in. And I don't want to be the person that launches a complaint. And so I'm just going to take it on the chin, or, however we refer to it, which is simply, not appropriate. And, that piece around turning a blind eye, I also think at times, one of the things we know around relational aggression is it's not necessarily visible to folks who aren't enmeshed in it. And so if you happen to be a manager who doesn't, for whatever reason, get to spend as much time on the floor as you perhaps need to really be aware of those workplace relationships, these sorts of things, you're not going to be aware of them when they're, we talk about dealing with things at the dot, as opposed to, becoming these really big issues. And so that level of awareness. But anyways, back to your question around that playing the game and how long staff would have to do it. And, it certainly seemed to be something, it was like this calculated debit balance sheet in their head, right? Like, and am I indebted to, like, am I in the positive or am I in the negative, right? And that wanting to make sure that was always level. And I think about, if you're in a a babysitting co-op, for example, right? A parenting co-op, and you're like sharing, oh, are we always withdrawing, we're always calling on folks to sit for our kids versus are we always sitting for other folks? And so I think, we tend to, in a lot of our relationships, sometimes think about those pieces. And so it certainly would occur, for a good couple of months, and I think particularly for those new staff, until they felt like they were able to prove themselves that they didn't, like there was this, I need to prove that I'm competent. And if I can prove that I can work independently and then can be seen as competent, well, then I can ask for help, because then staff know that this whole notion of what a legitimate request for help is versus a non-legitimate request for help. But again, I think it speaks to, if you're someone who is aware of these power relationships, the steps that you might take. So for example, one of the carrieds in the study was very in tune with this and thought about how she would have to work. But if you're, again, someone who comes from another culture, from another country, are you picking up on those same subtleties? And then are you penalized for that? So I don't know that there's like a set period of time for that, but I do think there's this ongoing balance sheet that folks have in their head, and that really is ongoing.
We have a question from Josephine. Josephine, did you want to hop off of mute, or should I voice your question? Okay, I will voice your question. So with respect to gendered care, Heather, did you notice any, are there any stories or interactions involving 2S LGBTQIA plus staff or persons in care?
There weren't in the particular study that we did, but again, it was that critical ethnography in those 2 care homes. And that wasn't something that came out in our research, but I don't doubt that adds yet another layer to that for sure, and something of which to be aware. Amanda's put Elisa's name in the chat, and yeah, she's done some really neat work in that area. So
thank you. Amanda Letty, you have a question. Did you want to come off a mute?
Sure, I can do that.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a great panel. I work in long-term care research at Island Health, and thinking a lot in my work about creating and sustaining positive change from the body of research evidence that we have in a number of different areas. It seems especially challenging to think about workplace incivility and methods we might use or approaches we might take to make change there, with a workforce that changes often, comes and goes. We know we have agency support in some homes. And also in Island Health, I believe our nurse educator roles are fairly scattered. We don't have a lot of those positions. So just curious if there was any thoughts or advice about some of the approaches we might take to build on and apply some of this great work in our practice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, for that question. And hi over there on the island. I think there's 2 things that come to mind. One is around the use of the Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee. And I kind of alluded to that in the work, and really trying to bring in that notion of what does our workplace look like in terms of psychological safety. There's some great work done. I think it originated out of SFU here in BC, the Guarding Minds at Work documents. And I think if you Google Guarding Minds at Work, that comes up. So thinking about kind of taking the pulse of the workplace culture and being able to use it in that way. And I think really just bringing it into the forefront. So we focus so much on physical well-being, but what about our mental health, and how do we make sure that we're discussing that, and what does our workplace culture look like, and are we supporting one another? So that's one of the things I think in terms of that occupational health and safety. And then the other one is thinking about how often in long-term care we start our shifts with report. That so often, and someone alluded to Dr. Sienna Casper's work, and I know Sienna's comments on this in some of her work. That first thing that we talk about is like, who has had a BM today and who hasn't? Who's on day 4, who's on day 2? We don't actually take that time to check in with each other. And, recognizing, I often say, some of us come to work with our baggage neatly folded up and tucked underneath our arm. And some of us are trundling a wheelie bag behind us. And so what if we took that moment at the start of report to simply do a check-in and say, where are people at? I have a colleague that uses like, how physically present and how psychologically present are you today, right? And it's like, it could be, well, I'm 100% physically present. I'm all here. I'm all in. But psychologically, you know what? I'm only at 60% because I was up all night because, my kid is, fighting something, or had an asthma attack, or, I had a fight with my partner before I came to work today. And so then creating that safe space to say, I'm not at 100% today. And so that, if I drop the ball on something, that's not intentional. Like, can you guys cover my back today? I'm just not all here today. Knowing that then that's what comes around goes around, that there's going to be another day when one of your other colleagues is not 100%. And that's what being a team is about. But so it's about creating that space when we check in and when we do report before we get to the residents. Can we take a moment and actually think about how we connect as staff, how we connect as a team? Because those opportunities just are really few and far between, I feel, in our work in long-term care. So just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you for that. So we will wrap up. I want to say thank you to Heather for sharing your research and for sharing the very practical and important toolkit. Thank you to Jennifer, Habib, Amanda, and Whitney for joining us in such a rich discussion about incivility and long-term care, and also highlighting the importance for future work in this area. If you have any questions for Heather, the panel, or myself, make sure to email me and I will connect you. We will see you again in 2 weeks for another seminar from Dr. Ann Killett from the University of East Anglia about involving older adults actively in research and improvement in care systems. We look forward to sharing more meaningful applied research with you again, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.